Over the course of a year and 2 months, I've viewed First Reformed over about 3 times. Yes, it's that fucking good, and I think it's worth talking about. First Reformed is written and directed by Paul Schrader, who is well known for writing Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, The Last Temptation of Christ, as well as his own films that he's directed. First Reformed centers on a minister of a small community church who is played by Ethan Hawke, who is asked to counsel a young climate activist who has just been released out of prison. Once the young man, played very well by Philip Ettinger, starts expressing his concerns regarding climate change as well as his own anti-natalist perspective, it seems pretty clear that despite the confidence we were certain Ethan Hawke's character was going to espouse in counseling the young man, especially with religious wisdom, it all went to shit the moment the kid started presenting facts to him, and that is one of the finer elements of the film. It would be a very black and white approach to say that First Reformed borders on being an anti-Christian or pro-atheist film. There's certainly an argument to be made that the film is promoting an awareness on climate change. However, on a deeper level, I think it delves more into having viewers reach a state of self-awareness that makes them question the what and why they believe what they've continued to believe for so very long, regardless of where those beliefs border, especially in relation to the current situation of what's going on in the world regarding climate change and global warming. And that is the central challenge Reverend Toller's character, Reverend Toller faces throughout the story. Following the suicide of the young activist he was counseling, which is shot and incorporated into the narrative in a way that reminds me of the Ingmar Bergman film Winter Light, and no, I am not talking about that god-awful Colin Farrell magic love drama where Will Smith plays Lucifer. But very much like First Reformed, Winter Light centers around a minister who struggles to maintain his faith in God, and very much like Ethan Hawke's Reverend Toller, Gunnar Borgenstrand, I hope I said his name right, his character has his faith challenged when he is put into a position where he has to counsel a young man played by the late Max von Sydow, who is overwhelmed by the fear of nuclear annihilation. Winter Light was made in the year 1963, around the time of the Cold War, where the fear of nuclear annihilation was at an all-time high, with massive anxiety and panic being a common symptom among people. Now, even though First Reformed does use a similar story element to that of Winter Light, calling it a rip-off, even a good one, would be a rather obtuse manner of thinking, given that both films examine a loner character in the middle of a crisis of faith, while at the same time touching on a global crisis of that proportions, and they are not the same story. They certainly have similar themes, and the overlying theme of First Reformed is finding the balance between hope and despair, which is introduced early on in the film when Toller speaks with the climate activist Michael. After he is asked by his pregnant wife Mary, brilliantly played by Amanda Seyfried, to speak with Toller, he's basically set up with a situation where he is forced to question his own belief in God, which in his narrations he actually finds some level of exhilaration in. I mean, you can only believe in what you believe in for so long without questioning it, that life essentially becomes boring when you're challenged. And if you're open-minded at the same time, there can be a level of excitement of it. I used to be religious, but my views changed, but not because of any personal tragedy. But moving on to a better subject matter, when you learn more about Toller's past, it's evidently clear that Paul Schrader is trying to bypass the stereotypical depiction cinema has given of Christians, even when done on a leniently liberal level, as opposed to the more obvious and overly used depiction of the more conservative bigots that make up the whole of America's right-wing segment. But enough about the Trump regime. Reverend Toller's backstory discusses how prior to becoming a minister at the First Reformed Community Church he works in, he served as a military chaplain, and from a long line of family members who served in the military. Toller's son himself had enlisted to fight in Iraq, of which in a period of 6 months he was killed. This death hit Toller very hard and even destroyed his marriage of his wife Esther, who is played by Victoria Hill, and who has, as a result, decided to no longer live with him. And she also works for Abundant Life, which is a large evangelical megachurch that owns the First Reformed Community Church. And I love how they portray it as somewhat of a semi-overwhelming force that proceeds not only over the church Toller works for, but it also works at the core of his being as a person. I don't consider myself a religious, as I mentioned, but in fact, I think my views align more with Michael's, excluding that of his anti-natalist perspective. Then again, when looking at the climate catastrophe our species continues to procrastinate on, only illustrates how even I might gravitate towards such a sentiment over time. Now, when it comes to a subject matter like abortion, which Michael considers in relation to his child being brought into what will be a near uninhabitable world over time, I've always leaned more towards the pro-choice side, where the decision ultimately falls under the reproductive rights the woman has, the actual autonomy to. However, the more fossil fuels that we burn into the air and the more CO2 fills the air we breathe, I wouldn't even need to bring up the naturally inherent reproductive rights of a woman to make a case for an abortion, when the act of bringing life into existence will most likely eventually reach a point where it's an act of cruelty. I mean, I don't want to discourage anyone from having a child, but at the same time, with how much limited time we have before the climate crisis continues to escalate and it becomes irreversible, I think in some way it could be an act of hubris, just to bring a life into an existence that will be nothing but painful and cruel. And speaking of cruelty, I mean, when Paul Schrader doesn't pull any punches when it comes to his criticism of capitalism and the inherent damages it commits against the environment. But when you're trying to tell a story that utilizes the subject of climate change, you can't go too far without focusing on just one company. Over the course of First Reform, we are reminded of Bulk Industries, a polluting factory with an even more poisonous CEO. I haven't seen this actor before. His name is Michael Gaston, and he plays Edward Bulk, the CEO of the company known as Bulk Industries, which we automatically learn serves as a financial backer to Abundant Life. In the short screen time that Michael Gaston has this film, which barely reaches probably 5 minutes, he plays Edward Bulk with such shallow and cold-hearted hypocrisy that you automatically just want to punch him every time he undermines Ethan Hawke's character, while pleading that they don't make the ceremony that that he is backing an Abundant Life and First Reform simultaneously anything political. All the while, he's actually doing this while eating apple pie, which is a great metaphor. I mean, there's no hint there for sure, but obviously it's a great metaphor that I rather enjoyed, because obviously when you look at Christianity and the story of the Garden of Eden and the snake and the apple, and you look at how venomous Edward Bulk is portrayed, it's not hard to put two and two together, and I just love that little detail that Paul Schrader added. But then it's not hard to take any of the hints Paul Schrader makes in this dark and rather meditative tale of what is surely a representation of his own struggles concerning his religious faith, because I read that he himself grew up very ingrained in a religious tradition, and even to this day considers himself a lapsed Protestant. Again, though, this film isn't desecrating or promoting religion so much as the self-awareness many people deny themselves in light of long-term harm we often shift to the side, most often as a result of a selfish shallowness that leaves us both empty and as blind as most of the characters within the film, who, on a continual basis ostracize Toller for simply saying things that are now thankfully coming more to light regarding the awareness of climate change. I mean, Toller is basically that person who stays silent throughout most of the time of the story. He's basically that guy who stays silent and is considered weird, but he's much more intelligent than he seems. But whenever he does open his mouth, he's demonized and made into a mascot for condemnation. I think there was the perfect example of this in the film I think one prominent example of the awareness of climate change is the rise of prominent youth groups, such as Seeding Sovereignty, Pioneers, the Red Nation, and many more. And I don't think you can talk about a film that uses the subject of climate change as a basis for its narrative without mentioning the incredible efforts of the 17-year-old climate activist Greta Thunberg, I hope I said her name right, who, through her own relentless honesty, has managed to spike up an awareness in the climate crisis we all face, so much so that she went after the UN in her famous "How Dare You" speech, which only illustrated the sort of bravery needed to challenge the bureaucratic powers that continue to favor profit, over the health and well-being of others. Now, as bad as climate change is and the dangers it poses to the many disrupted ecosystems that face extinction, you can also look at how people in the more underprivileged and lower-class communities often suffer the side effects of climate change caused by capitalism more detrimentally, and you can't look any further than pollution. The fact that a 17-year-old girl alone is fighting to make sure the world has greater awareness of this subject is not only astounding, but instrumental in making sure that the situation doesn't get so bad that the climate movement doesn't devolve into the more radical extremism violence that First Reformed depicts within the character of Michael, who Reverend Toller discovers has an explosive vest. He later contemplates using this vest as he becomes more ingrained in the subject of the climate catastrophe we are currently facing. Now, this depiction of political extremism is nothing new when it comes to Paul Schrader's aesthetic and his characters. In fact, when looking back to a film like Taxi Driver, it becomes much more evident within the context of how, very much like First Reformed, the film also tackled a political extremism with a focus on the invasion of Vietnam and how his protagonist Travis Bickle most likely suffered from PTSD. However, to make any inclination that Schrader was using his characters as a way of advocating for any form of political violence, despite showing them in a sympathetic light, would be missing the point. Both characters like Toller and Bickle are without a doubt very psychologically tormented men who have undoubtedly been through a great deal of pain and trauma as the basis for their downward spirals into madness. However, I think the push they make into the realm of political extremism is more aligned with Schrader stating how if the systems that perpetuate such injustices that trigger civil disobedience continue to perpetuate the damage they ensure, then it won't be very long before political violence will take the fold and possibly do more damage to causes like climate awareness. The last thing any just cause worth pursuing needs is the kind of extremism that not only gives it a bad reputation, but it also invites those in the opposition to use stereotypes as a way of destroying any credibility behind the cause. At this point in time, based on the amount of massive progression a movement on climate change needs, it seems that at some point, desperation will take the fold and essentially be the dominant voice behind an extremist faction that will see no other option. I mean, I don't want to be objective. I mean, time will tell, but the fact that not much is getting done and now the Trump administration has basically has just suspended all EPA regulations to energy companies. I mean, I read something about that. I'll go into more detail as this review progresses. Now, when it comes to the ending of First Reformed, a lot has been said regarding its essential meaning. And near the end of the consecration ceremony, Toller was supposed to head. He prepares to commit suicide via the explosive vest he got from Michael. It is only after he sees that Mary is attending the ceremony that he decides to change his mind at the last second and commit suicide via poisoning. However, even that attempt fails, or does it? That's not abundantly made clear, and this is where the things become even weirder as the ending of First Reformed concludes with Mary supposedly, and I use the word supposedly in a rather strong context, given that one thing to take into account is that the film went out of its way to show that Toller had locked the door to his personal quarters at the church, which made it virtually impossible for anyone to enter. Another thing to take into account is the song that his ex-wife Esther sings at the ceremony while he's committing suicide is that of Mahalia Jackson's Leaning on the Everlasting Arms. As the song plays out and Mary says the word Ernst to Toller, both passionately embrace and kiss each other. And then the film abruptly cuts to black. I know, it's not the most clear-cut ending imaginable, however, at the same time, given that this film borders on an auteur form of cinema, nobody can doubt that as a writer and a director, Paul Schrader is very much an auteur. This ending is made to be far more metaphorical and open to interpretation than direct. I've seen plenty of reviews illustrating how the ending is really a representation of the theme of hope and despair that was brought up in the beginning of the film when Toller first met and counseled Michael. And one quote from that really stands out, and I'll recite it right here. "Courage is the solution to despair. Reason provides no answers. I can't know what the future will bring. We have to choose despite uncertainty. Wisdom is holding two contradictory truths in mind simultaneously, hope and despair. A life without despair is a life without hope. Holding these two ideas in our hand is life itself." This small speech, although a bit preachy, does illustrate the intention of the story, as well as the inherent relevance the ending constitutes. At some point in the film, during one of Toller's voiceover narrations as he journals, he discusses the ambiguity of what a person might be thinking in the final moments of their life. He illustrates both potentially good and bad ideas, looking at how that final scene embraces in a logical context while at the same time abruptly cutting to black. I think it's safe to say and to assume that he was dying in that moment while seeing something he felt to be absolutely beautiful, because his relationship with Amanda Seyfried's character is not portrayed as I think it's portrayed as some tentative romance, but not overly dramatic, or it's never even fantasized or glamorized. I mean, I think he has feelings for her for certain, but I think at the same time, she represents some level of purity. I mean, her name is Mary, and when you look at the name Mary in a Christian context, you think of the Virgin Mary, and she's pregnant with a child, even though she had a husband. However, you can tell that by looking at her character and what she represents to Ethan Hawke's Reverend Toller and the friendship they develop, she represents this purity that not something he's unfamiliar with, but you rarely see. She's a genuinely good person. Again, but then when looking back in the ending, it's hard to determine in an objective fashion, given that it isn't clear-cut and it's made more to challenge our own perspectives of how to navigate life, because as much as on the surface analysis of this film could border on labeling it a pro-climate change film, which is certainly fair, it would be far more sophisticated in saying that the ultimate message of First Reform lies with the idea of carrying hope and despair hand in hand, especially in the most difficult times. Now that we're in the midst of a global pandemic that is shattering our global economy while at the same time isolating us even further, it's important to carry a sense of hope through what will be very despairing times. While promoting the film, Paul Schrader expressed his own cynicism of how humanity will most likely not survive the century. As pessimistic as this may sound, there is a level of understanding to it, given the damage that has been done and continues to be done, especially with the most recent news of the Trump administration suspending environmental regulations in the midst of the pandemic. I mean, I don't want to sound cynical myself, but tough times are certainly ahead for us, and despite that, it's important that we keep the fire of hope alive, along with the very despair that challenges it to become stronger.